Hey everyone! So, episode 2 of the Seething Spectre Sevagoth guide series. That is a mouthful. Whew! This is a series I started because I am one of the few people who main Sevagoth and felt that, you know, maybe some other people might like to pick him up but just get too confused because there's not a lot of resources on how to really play him that well. With that said, in this video I will be covering all of Sevagoth's abilities, a bit of tidbits here and there about them, and also how to obtain Sevagoth in the first place. This is far from the end, of course, for episode 2, with future episodes including things like weapon suggestions and even a gameplay breakdown to kind of get an idea of what I'm thinking whenever I'm in missions. Thanks to the recent channel growth as well, I now have access to the community tab, which I'll be using to hold polls and all sorts of different things to update you all on new videos and maybe game suggestions. With that said, on to the video. Added in 2021 alongside the Call of the Tempest Sari quest, Sevagoth is a frame that provides a lot at the cost of, well, being very costly. To list a few things that Sevagoth provides for those who are curious, we have high survivability with Gloom and his unique self-reviving passive, a damage increase with Reap and its augment, scaling damage with the 2-1 combo that he has, which I'll cover later, strong crowd control thanks to Gloom, once again, high synergy between all of his abilities, incredibly high damage with Shadow Form, and most of his abilities do not need line of sight in order to function. Because, you know, walls are for fucking nerds. To actually get Sevagoth, you will need a few things beforehand, and they can get very costly. Firstly, you'll actually need a Railjack, and then you'll need to complete the Call of the Tempest Sari quest. After that, you'll need to either unlock the Neptune, Pluto, or Vale Proxima in order to access the Void Storms there, as that is where his parts drop. I would recommend farming in the Pluto Proxima, as Neptune has a lower drop chance, and while the Vale does have the same drop chance as Pluto, it also has incredibly higher levels, so not really worth it. In order to actually craft Sevagoth, you'll need 3 main parts and the main blueprint, as per usual, with the main blueprint coming from the Call of the Tempest Sari quest itself. For the Neuroptics, you'll need 15,000 credits, 6 Neurodes, 1200 Titanium, 750 Rubido, and 2,750 Salvage Metal. For the Chassis, you will again need 15,000 credits, 8 Morphics, 650 Cryotic, 2 Nullstones, and 3,300 Alloy Plates. For the Systems, you will again need 15,000 credits, 2 Argon Crystals, 250 Oxium, 12 Asterite, and 2,950 Nanospores. Once you have all the parts crafted, you'll need another 15,000 credits, all of the parts themselves, and then 3 Organ Cells in order to construct Sevagoth himself. Quickly looking at his stats, upon reaching rank 30, we have 300 health, 270 shields, 150 armor, 188 energy, and a speed of 0.95, which is roughly average compared to most other frames. Now, if all that information somehow didn't scare you off, don't worry, there is so much more. Okay, let's start with his passive. Upon death, Sevagoth will summon his tomb and unleash his shadow. During this time, you can consume 5 enemies with shadow in order to self-revive at literally no cost. Is this insanely strong? Absolutely. And once we get into the finer details, you start to realize how hilariously ridiculous this passive is. Firstly, this can be done infinitely. There is no cap on how many times you can self-revive with this passive. So, good luck actually dying outside of maybe arbitrations, because it doesn't work there. During this passive, Sevagoth's Shadow only has access to Consume. However, Consume is boosted to deal 100% damage, ignoring all armor and shields and damage reduction auras, but Overguard can still stop you. Hiya, Editing Ion here. So, something I forgot to mention in the original recording of this is that while, yes, you can light attack beyond certain bugs, you can actually consistently heavy attack while downed, so you could theoretically remove the Overguard of an enemy and then consume them to contribute to the passive. I just wanted to add that in, sorry. Now, if you do happen to fail to actually collect 5 souls, you will die properly and will need to use up a revive. You also need to watch out for things like Hounds and Acolytes, as they can actually lock your shadow out of using Consume, which is, of course, not fun. Though, if you're with a team, don't worry, they can still revive you normally by interacting with your tomb, just like it were your actual body. Starting with Sevagoth's actual abilities, we have Reap. This has Sevagoth cast out his shadow and deal radiation damage in a bubble around the shadow itself, and also afflicting enemies with the Death's Harvest debuff. The debuff itself is essentially a damage multiplier, so if you have a 50% debuff, you'll be doing plus 0.5 times more damage. This ability also got a new augment recently called Shadow Haze, which increases the crit chance on enemies afflicted by Death's Harvest. Killing enemy enemies afflicted by Death's Harvest with this augment will also cause them to summon a new shadow that acts exactly like the one you cast, minus the ability to actually aim it manually. Killing enemies afflicted by Death's Harvest will also charge your death well by 5%, which is going to be important later. Reap also has a unique synergy when paired with So, which I'll get onto very soon. Speaking of So, actually, So is Sevagoth's second ability. When cast, any enemies actually hit by the ability will start to take a damage over time in the form of true damage. And, once again, no line of sight requirements, so if you don't have any enemy detection, this can work weirdly well as a sort of damage radar, essentially? I don't know. Now, the damage type of this ability is super important because true damage ignores armor, shields, and damage reduction auras. So if you really want to boost the actual damage of this ability so it just kills enemies regardless of armor, you could probably bring along a Panzerwolfephiler and also use your first ability, Reap, before casting So, albeit there is a reason why you might want to do it the other way. Afflicting enemies with So and then casting Reap will cause them to explode, dealing 25% of their max health as blast damage to other nearby enemies. For some reason, this also causes Reap to actually tick twice for some reason. I'm not sure why, but I'm not going to complain. Damage is damage. You need to be careful when casting this ability because as long as there is one enemy still alive but affected, you can't recast this ability. Yes, it's as frustrating as it sounds. The ability also has damage fall off, with it being able to lose 75% of its max damage if the enemy is too far away. The synergy between Reap and So does also mean Sevagoth is very energy hungry as you'll be casting these both quite frequently. And lastly, just like Reap, So will grant 5% extra charge to the death well if it kills an enemy. Moving over to Sevagoth's third ability, we have Gloom. Gloom is an AoE aura that, upon first cast, slowly grows out over time until it reaches its max range. Enemies within its range are slowed, and you also gain lifesteal. Your team can also benefit from this lifesteal if they're within range of Gloom. And, just like the other abilities, no line of sight requirement. You can affect enemies through walls still. Additionally, just like the other abilities, Gloom does contribute to your Deathwell charge. However, it only grants 0.1% Deathwell charge per second per enemy. So, yeah, this might take a while. Gloom Slow is also capped, but it's at 95%, so boo-hoo. Much like other channel abilities, Gloom does drain energy over time, however, it depends on whether there are a certain amount of enemies within the field or not. If there are no enemies within Gloom's radius, you actually don't have any energy drained whatsoever. However, for every enemy within the field, you will slowly have 0.75 energy drained per second, up to a maximum of 10 enemies, which means Gloom is also Sevagoth's Subsume, so yeah, you can give any frame in the game a 95% slow and lifesteal. This obviously has hurt Sevagoth's popularity a bit, but he's slowly getting there. He hasn't completely forgotten that he exists. Also, rather funny fact actually, this can affect fighters in Railjack, so if you're actually close enough to them, you can slow them. Is this a good idea? Absolutely not, but it is absolutely hilarious. And we have Sevagoth's last ability, except Psych, because it's actually just a second Warframe, Exalted Shadow. Phew. Once Deathwell is over 75% charged, as indicated by the Deathwell glowing white instead of purple, Sevagoth can unleash his Exalted Shadow, leaving his normal form behind in a stationary, invulnerable state. The Shadow itself is treated as an entirely separate Warframe, with its own mod slots and arcanes, and even an aura slot. The Shadow is restricted to melee combat, but the Shadow's claws that it comes equipped with are insanely strong, and are moddable like any other melee, which does mean you will need a small fortune of Forma. Taking a quick look at the stats, we have 300 health, 150 shields, 450 armor, 150 energy, and then a speed of 1.1. Amidst the many quirks that Shadow has, dying isn't the end, as instead you'll just regain control of Sevagoth. Shadow can also make use of the mod Preparation to fill its energy upon every cast, as it's considered a fresh spawn. Any arcane stats, such as Arcane Blessing's health bonus, are not reset in between casts. So don't worry, you don't need to recollect those health orbs. However, it will reset if you fully die, but that's to be expected. The Shadow also makes use of any Archon shards installed into Sevagoth, gaining the exact same benefits, which is insanely strong. What's also cool is that things like Gloom aren't deactivated upon going into Shadow form, with it actually remaining fully active, so you can actually pull enemies within Gloom's reach and then just heal off of them. With that said, unfortunately subsumes do not gain this level of synergy, so yeah, don't bother. As mentioned before, Shadow has its own abilities, starting off with Embrace. Embrace has Sevagoth's Shadow pull all enemies in towards it in a cone, stopping right in front of it for easy melee kills. And yes, if you think this sounds like a pocket larva, that's because it is. Yeah, it's arguably better actually because it has far better range. Other than that, it's a pretty no-nonsense ability, which is going to be a consistent theme with most of Shadow's abilities. Strong, but simple. Next up, we have Consume. Upon casting, Sevagoth's Shadow will rush towards any enemies, stealing health and dealing percentage-based damage that bypasses armor, alongside dealing a flat amount of damage. Most players get a little confused with this ability since they think it's like Reeve, but not really. You actually have to have the enemies within your crosshairs in order to actually target them. The ability also has a slight bit of vertical restriction. I don't know the exact limit of it. It's just kind of going to have to be trial and error, I'm afraid, for you to figure this out. The way I personally treat it is that if I'm basically not the same height as I would be if I was standing on the enemy's head, I'm probably going to miss. The ability also forces enemies down onto the ground, much like a blast proc, so this could be used as a weird panic incapacitation ability. Returning again to simple no-nonsense, we have Death's Harvest. This is essentially Shadow Form's version of Reap, with it applying the exact same debuff. One thing to note, however, is that the debuff in Shadow Form scales off of Shadow's strength, not Sevagoth's. Despite this disconnect, it does actually gain benefits from Shadow Haze, with it spawning shadows on afflicted enemies, and granting the crit boost. However, Shadow's Claws don't get that same crit boost. This is explained in a video I made previously, which you should go watch that. Yeah. And lastly, we have Reunite. This is pretty simple. It basically returns control to Sevagoth's body. However, it does teleport Sevagoth to wherever Shadow was, so you can use it as a weird form of traversal. This ability is also kind of forced if Shadow dies or Sevagoth's main body gets touched by a nullifier bubble. In either of these two cases, you won't actually get teleported to Shadow's position, instead returning to wherever Sevagoth's main body was instead. And that's that. Abilities, my personal build, and for the most part, everything I need to cover in this video. Weapons, and of course a gameplay breakdown will be coming in the future, but, well, I'm a bit tired. Sevagoth has a very special place in my heart, which is why I was very excited to actually start working on this video. He is a very resource-intense frame and energy-hungry, with arguably one of the more difficult kits to grasp, but for me, that's kind of how I like it. And when built right, he can be an absolute monster. I sometimes find myself out DPSing Saren and Maces. And, of course, one of us doesn't have to care about walls.